There comes a moment in many human lives when the noise begins to change, not suddenly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a background hum that you didn't notice until it stopped. And somewhere between youth and old age, between striving and slowing, between becoming and being, people often find themselves unsettled in ways they don't fully understand, asking questions that never seemed urgent before, wondering why achievements that once felt meaningful now feel strangely hollow, or why paths once chosen with confidence now feel unfamiliar. And this moment is what we often call a midlife crisis, though the word crisis itself is misleading, because in many cultures, including Chinese culture, the word crisis carries a double meaning, danger on one hand and opportunity on the other. And the truth is that midlife is not simply a breakdown. It is a crossroads, a turning point where the direction of one's inner life becomes harder to ignore. And what happens here matters deeply, not because it decides everything, but because it reveals what was already forming all along. In the first half of life, most of us are busy building, becoming, proving, surviving, fitting in, and meeting expectations, both our own and those placed upon us by family, culture, and society. And during this time, the questions are often practical. Who should I be? What should I do? How do I succeed? How do I belong? How do I survive? And these questions are necessary, because without structure, identity, and direction, a young person cannot function in the world. But the danger comes when we mistake these early answers for permanent truths, when the roles we learn to play become prisons rather than tools. And midlife is often the moment when the soul, the deeper self, begins to resist living entirely on borrowed scripts. Carl Jung spoke about this beautifully when he described the second half of life as the time of individuation, a process not of becoming someone new, but of becoming whole, of integrating the parts of ourselves that were ignored, suppressed, postponed, or sacrificed in the service of adaptation. And individuation does not mean rejecting the life we built, but questioning whether it reflects who we truly are. And this questioning can feel deeply uncomfortable, because it threatens the identity we worked so hard to construct. And this is why midlife can feel like a crisis, because it asks us to let go of certainty, to tolerate ambiguity, and to look inward rather than outward for validation. Some people, when faced with this inner turning point, choose growth, consciously or unconsciously, and begin to reflect, to soften, to become more honest with themselves, to accept their limitations, to reconcile with their past, and to deepen their understanding of who they are beyond roles and achievements. And others, faced with the same discomfort, choose distraction, denial, or escalation, doubling down on external validation, chasing youth, power, pleasure, or control. Not because they are shallow, but because inward attention feels too threatening. And the path taken during midlife often depends less on willpower than on the emotional groundwork laid much earlier in life. In many religious traditions, the age of 40 is marked as significant, not because it carries magical power, but because it symbolically represents maturity, a time when illusions have worn thin and responsibility becomes unavoidable. And in Islam, 40 is often described as the age of full mental and spiritual maturity. While in Christianity, many periods of transformation and testing are symbolically associated with 40, and across cultures, this age appears again and again as a threshold between outward striving and inward reckoning. And this is not accidental, because by midlife, most people have experienced enough loss, disappointment, compromise, and change to realize that life does not unfold according to plan, and this realization can either humble us or harden us. Whether midlife becomes a time of growth or deterioration is influenced strongly by how the earlier stages of life were navigated, especially the foundational years of toddlerhood and adolescence, when identity, trust, autonomy, and belonging are first formed. Because if a child's early identity crises were handled with enough support, attunement, and safety, if caregivers and environments allowed the child to explore who they were without excessive shame, fear, or suppression, then that child grows into an adult who is better equipped to face later uncertainty. And when midlife arrives, the inner questions, though challenging, do not feel annihilating, but manageable, even meaningful. On the other hand, if those early identity struggles were met with neglect, control, inconsistency, or invalidation, if a child learned early that certain parts of themselves were unacceptable, dangerous, or unlovable, then much of adult life becomes an exercise in compensation, adaptation, and performance, and midlife, rather than opening into growth, threatens to expose everything that was buried. And this exposure can feel unbearable, leading some to retreat further into denial, resentment, or self-destructive behaviors, not because they are weak, but because the inner scaffolding needed to face oneself gently was never fully built. Yet here is where the conversation takes a turn that many people find difficult but strangely comforting, because no matter how much we analyze, explain, or interpret midlife, there is another way of understanding it altogether. One that steps outside psychology, self-help, and even moral judgment. And this is the perspective of fate, or determinism. The idea that whatever unfolds in our lives was already written into the fabric of existence long before we became aware of it. Not in a simplistic sense that removes meaning, but in a deeper sense that removes blame. And from this perspective, the midlife crisis, whether it leads to growth or collapse, is not a mistake. Not a failure, not a moral test, but an unfolding, a natural expression of causes and conditions stretching back through childhood, ancestry, culture, biology, and even the cosmos itself. When we look at life this way, resentment begins to loosen its grip. Because how can we fully blame ourselves or others for outcomes that arose from countless interconnected factors, many of which were never under conscious control? And this does not mean we become passive or indifferent, but that we stop carrying unnecessary shame and guilt, because guilt assumes that we could have chosen differently with the same internal and external conditions, and determinism gently reminds us that every choice arises from who we were at that moment, shaped by everything that came before. This is why making peace with the mystery of life becomes so important during midlife. Because the mind, having spent decades trying to control outcomes, slowly realizes that control was always partial at best, and surrender, not as defeat, but as acceptance, becomes a form of wisdom. And when we stop fighting reality, something curious happens. The inner conflict softens, the need to assign blame diminishes, and compassion, both for ourselves and others, becomes more natural, because we begin to see everyone as expressions of the same unfolding process, doing the best they could with what they had. This perspective also reframes the idea of success and failure. Because if life is a predetermined unfolding, then the purpose of midlife is not to correct mistakes, but to understand them, not to rewrite the past, but to integrate it. And integration is the heart of individuation, bringing together what was split, rejected, or denied. And this does not require dramatic changes, but quiet honesty, a willingness to sit with discomfort, and an openness to not knowing who we are becoming next. Many people fear midlife because it confronts them with limits of time, energy, possibility, and illusion. But limits are not punishments. They are containers. And within containers, meaning becomes clearer, and midlife invites us to stop chasing infinite potential and start inhabiting actual life with all its imperfections, contradictions, and unfinished stories. And this invitation is not given to punish us for past choices, but to deepen our relationship with existence itself. Seen this way, the midlife crisis is not something to be avoided or cured, but something to be listened to. Because it carries information, not commands, and it asks questions rather than giving answers. And whether we respond with curiosity or fear determines how it feels, but not whether it happens, because it happens as naturally as seasons change, and like seasons, it cannot be rushed or skipped. And perhaps the most liberating realization of all is that even if midlife unfolds painfully, even if it leads to confusion, loss, or breakdown, it was still part of the larger design. Not a detour, not a punishment, but a chapter that belonged. And when we see this, the pressure to get it right dissolves, and what remains is a gentle acceptance of life as it is, not as it should have been. And this acceptance does not erase pain, but it removes the extra suffering we add by resisting what cannot be changed. We are not isolated individuals struggling alone through time. We are interconnected processes shaped by relationships, environments, histories, and forces far beyond personal intention. And midlife is simply the moment when this interconnectedness becomes harder to ignore, because the illusion of total independence has worn thin, and what remains is the quiet truth that we were never separate to begin with. Not from our past, not from others, not from the world, and not from the mystery that moves through all things. So whether midlife brings growth or crisis, clarity or confusion, peace or restlessness, it was always part of the story. And the task is not to judge it, but to live it with as much awareness as possible, trusting that even now, even here, life knows what it is doing, and that making peace with that mystery is not giving up, but finally coming home. Thank you for watching, and please subscribe for more.